Matanzas, Cuba. February 1879. In a locked room in the great house of the San Jose Hacienda, a 38-year-old widow was about to speak words that would destroy and save her family simultaneously. Doña Mariana de Albuquerque had summoned her 5 daughters in absolute secrecy. Josefa, 22. Amelia, 20. Constanza, 18. Laura, 16. And little Beatriz, barely 13. What Doña Mariana was about to propose wasn't just immoral. It wasn't just scandalous. It was so impossibly transgressive that if discovered, it would annihilate their lives completely. Because Doña Mariana had decided her 4 oldest daughters would bear children with a slave. With Miguel de Angola, the most intelligent, strongest man among the 200 slaves on her plantation. And she wasn't insane, she was desperate. 2 years of widowhood had shown Mariana the horrifying truth about aristocratic Cuban society. She'd watched friends married to violent alcoholics who gambled away fortunes. She'd seen widows stripped of inheritances by laws favoring men. Her own marriage was tolerable only because her husband spent most of his time in Havana with his mistress, leaving Mariana to run the hacienda. But now the vultures were circling. Suitors wanted her daughters not for love but to seize the mellow fortune. These men would see her granddaughters as merchandise for future alliances. The cycle would continue forever unless Mariana did something unthinkable. Her plan was devastatingly simple. Her 4 oldest daughters would become pregnant by Miguel months apart to avoid suspicion. They'd remain unmarried under her protection. The children would be raised as legitimate mellow offspring no father acknowledged. When questions became too insistent, she'd invent stories about secret marriages to merchants who died in accidents. The crucial thing? Her daughters would have children without surrendering control to men who'd treat them as property. But why Miguel? First, as a slave, he had 0 legal rights. He couldn't claim paternity or inheritance. Second, Miguel was exceptional, standing 1.90 meters tall, extraordinarily strong, literate in Portuguese and Spanish, intelligent enough to oversee other slaves. In Mariana's mind, influenced by eugenic pseudoscience, Miguel would produce healthy, strong grandchildren. Third, Miguel could be absolutely controlled. She could threaten him with sale to the copper mines where life expectancy was 3 years, or offer him what every slave craved, his freedom. "My daughters," Mariana began, voice steady despite the terror inside. "What I'm proposing will seem like madness, like unforgivable sin. But before you judge me, listen completely. Understand why this is necessary." Josefa, the eldest, had 3 suitors. A 50-year-old widower with 6 children needing a housekeeper, a gambler who'd lost his plantation and desperately needed capital, and a man so cruel that if he treated his slaves brutally, how would he treat a wife who legally would also be his property? "Josefa," Mariana continued, staring directly at her oldest daughter, "which of those men do you want to surrender your life to? Which gets control over your body, your will, your inheritance?" Josefa's eyes filled with tears. "Mother, I don't want to marry any of them, but what choice do I have? If I don't marry, I'll be a spinster, mocked and pitied. And when you're gone, I'll be completely vulnerable without a man's protection in a society that doesn't recognize single women's rights." "Exactly," Mariana responded. "That's why I've created a plan giving you what society demands, children, without surrendering control of your lives to men who'll see you as property. You'll have children, but not with those horrible suitors. You'll have them with Miguel." The silence was absolute and terrifying. Then Amelia exploded. "Miguel, the slave? Mother, have you lost your mind? You're suggesting we sleep with a slave? Have children with him? It's unthinkable, mortal sin, an abomination." Mariana had prepared for this. More sinful than selling you to men who'll make you miserable forever? More unnatural than this system treating you as property I must transfer through marriage? Think about what I'm offering. Freedom, control over your own lives. Children who are completely yours, not property of some husband who could take them away. Constanza, always the most thoughtful, spoke with trembling voice. "But mother, the children will have features. Features showing their ancestry. How do we explain that? How do we hide the truth?" "Valid question." Mariana had an answer. "Miguel has relatively light skin for being Angolan. Many Cuban slaves have mixed ancestry. The children will probably have skin tones we can explain as inheritance from distant ancestors common in Cuban families who don't discuss it publicly. We'll invent stories about the fathers. Secret marriages to Portuguese merchants who died in accidents. The stories don't need to be completely believable, just plausible enough that polite people won't ask direct questions." Laura, only 16, cried openly, "Mother, I'm too young. I don't want this. Don't force me." Mariana knelt before Laura, taking her trembling hands. "My love, I know this is terrible and unfair, but think about the alternative. In 2 years, suitors will arrive and you'll be married to someone I can't control. This way, you stay under my protection. You have a child giving you mother status without surrendering your life to a husband." For 2 hours, Mariana explained every detail. Encounters with Miguel would occur in an isolated house on the property's edge, each daughter separately, months between pregnancies. Miguel would be threatened with sale to the mines if he refused or revealed the truth. But he'd also be promised his carta de alforja, his legal freedom, once all 4 pregnancies completed successfully. Beatriz, at 13, was excluded. Too young even by 1,879 standards. The encounters would begin immediately with Josefa, once pregnant, Amelia 3 months later, then Constanza, finally Laura. By spring 1880, all 4 babies would be born with intervals seeming natural. "What happens to Miguel after?" Josefa asked coldly. "Do you kill him to eliminate the witness?" "I free him," Mariana responded firmly. "I give him his carta de alforja as promised. He'll have legal freedom and money to establish himself in Havana. He won't be murdered or sold. He fulfilled his part, I fulfill mine." "How generous," Amelia said with bitter sarcasm. "You take 4 children he can never know, but give him freedom. What magnificent maternal kindness." Mariana didn't respond because Amelia was right. Nothing noble existed in this plan. It was pure manipulation, using a man with no power to refuse, stealing any right to fatherhood. But Mariana believed the alternative was worse. Better this than daughters trapped in miserable marriages, beaten by drunk husbands, stripped of inheritances, converted into air-producing machines for men who didn't love them. After hours of tears and anguished discussion, the 4 daughters accepted. Not because they wanted to, not because they thought it was right, but confronted with brutal realities of their society, with limited options as women in 1879 Cuba, their mother's horrible plan seemed marginally better than alternatives. That night, Mariana summoned Miguel to the library past midnight. Miguel de Angola was 35. He'd been purchased 5 years earlier at a Havana slave market. Captured in Angola at 28, he'd survived the hellish slave ship journey, survived 5 years in cane fields where many died in year 1. When Mariana explained what she expected, Miguel remained completely still for a long moment, then spoke with carefully controlled voice. "Doña Mariana, are you ordering me to sleep with your daughters, all 4? "It's not an order," Mariana lied. "It's a proposal. In exchange for cooperation, I promise something worth more than anything. Your carta de alforja, your legal freedom. Once pregnancies complete successfully and children are born healthy, you'll be a free man." Miguel's expression was unreadable. "And if I refuse, if I say this is too much, then I sell you tomorrow to the Santiago copper mines," Mariana responded with flat, cold voice, "where average life expectancy is 3 years, or to mountain coffee plantations where slaves are literally worked to death. The choice is yours, Miguel. Freedom in 1 year or slow certain death in the mines." It wasn't really a choice, pure coercion. using absolute power as slave owner to force Miguel into something he'd never voluntarily choose. But Miguel was pragmatic. He'd survived too long as a slave not to understand when he had no real options. "The children," he asked finally. "What happens to them? Can I know them? Will I have any rights?" "No," Mariana said without softening truth. "The children will be my grandchildren legally. You'll have no rights, no paternity recognition. Once freed, you leave and never see them again. That's the deal. Your freedom for your absolute permanent silence about their paternity." Miguel closed his eyes. When he opened them, pure pain showed. "So I'm not really being offered freedom. I'm being offered different slavery. I'll be legally free, yes, but live the rest of my life knowing I have 4 children somewhere in Cuba I'll never know, who'll never know who I am, who'll grow up thinking their father is some invented ghost." "That's not freedom, Doña Mariana. That's torment. It's the only offer you have," Mariana responded. "Accept or reject, but decide now." Miguel breathed deeply. "I accept, because 3 years in mines versus freedom with emotional torment is still obvious choice. But I want you to know something, Doña Mariana. What you're doing is monstrous. Not just to me, but to your own daughters. You're using them like you're using me. And someday, when this comes to light, because secrets like this always surface, eventually, you'll have to face what you've done." The encounters began a week later in March 1879. Josefa was first. When Mariana left her alone with Miguel in the isolated house, the initial silence was unbearably tense. Finally, Miguel spoke. "Señorita Josefa, this is terrible for both of us. I won't pretend it isn't, but we can at least try to treat each other with mutual dignity in these impossible circumstances." Josefa looked up, surprised to hear the slave speak Spanish so articulately. She'd spent 22 years seeing Miguel work the fields, but never had a direct conversation with him. Slaves were landscape, as ignored as furniture. "How can you speak of dignity in this?" Josefa asked, voice trembling between fury and fear. "My mother is essentially prostituting me with a slave. There's no possible dignity here." "You're right," Miguel responded. "There's no dignity in being forced." "I'm also being forced, Señorita Josefa. Your mother threatened me with the mines if I refused. So we're both here against our real will. We're both victims of your mother in different ways." That stopped Josefa. She'd never considered Miguel was also being victimized. She'd been so consumed by her own humiliation, she hadn't thought about his perspective. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I'm sorry for what my mother is doing to you. I'm sorry for this whole horrible system that enslaved you. I never thought much about slavery before. It was simply how things were. But this is forcing me to see it differently." For the next hour, they talked. Miguel told her about Angola, about his village before capture. Josefa told him about her suffocating life, how she'd never been allowed to question anything. Something unexpected happened. They began seeing each other as complete human beings trapped in a brutal system. When they finally lay together, it was with unexpected tenderness. It wasn't love, but it was human. Encounters with Amelia 3 months later followed similar patterns. Constanza was different, the most intellectual sister. When she met Miguel in September 1879, there wasn't tension. Instead, curiosity. "I want to know what you think about all this," Constanza said directly. "Really, Miguel. The truth." Miguel looked at her. "Your mother is a monster with understandable motivations. This plan is an atrocity built on another atrocity, the entire slavery system. You and your sisters are simultaneously victims and perpetrators, victims of society seeing you as matrimonial merchandise, but also perpetrators participating in my rape, even under coercion. I'm going to have 4 children I'll never know, and that will haunt me every day for the rest of my life." Constanza didn't look away. "You're right about everything. There's no way to make this right. We can only try to be as human as possible within this monstrosity." Over following weeks, Constanza and Miguel developed something neither anticipated. Not love, but genuine connection. The beginning of feelings both knew were dangerous and impossible. Both realized this would make everything infinitely more painful when it ended. Laura, the youngest at 16, had the most difficult encounters. She didn't have the emotional or intellectual maturity to process what was happening. She cried frequently. Miguel, who by then had developed practice navigating these impossible situations, was extraordinarily gentle with her, more protective older brother than anything else, trying to minimize inevitable trauma. By December 1879, the plan was working exactly as Mariana calculated. Josefa was 9 months pregnant, Amelia in her 6th month, Constanza just confirmed pregnant. Laura would confirm in January. The hacienda buzzed with rumors. Mariana had prepared cover stories. Josefa had been secretly married to a Portuguese merchant who died in a boat accident. Amelia had romanced a Spanish engineer who returned to Spain. The stories were barely believable but had enough specific details that polite people didn't ask direct questions. But someone didn't swallow the stories. Doña Feliciana Ruiz, the seamstress who regularly visited to make dresses for the Mello sisters, was a 50-year-old woman with hawk eyes and ears hearing every whisper. She'd noticed too many coincidences. How the sisters disappeared for hours toward the former administrator's house. How Miguel also frequently disappeared in the same directions. The looks Constanza and Miguel exchanged when they thought no one watched. Looks containing too much intimacy to be appropriate between mistress and slave. And Doña Feliciana, who'd never had enough money to feel secure, saw opportunity. In January 1880, with Josefa 9.5 months pregnant, about to give birth any moment, Doña Feliciana requested a private meeting with Doña Mariana. Doña Mariana, she began with voice sweet as poisoned honey. I've been reflecting on the interesting stories circulating about your daughters. Dead Portuguese merchants, Spanish engineers returning to Europe. Such tragic stories, so convenient, so difficult to verify. Mariana felt her blood freeze but kept expression perfectly neutral. What are you insinuating, Doña Feliciana? I'm not insinuating anything, Doña Mariana, simply observing. And I observe there's a slave on your property who frequently disappears toward the same house where your daughters disappear. A very tall, very remarkable slave. And I observe your grandchildren, about to be born, will probably have interesting characteristics some malicious people might interpret in scandalous ways. Mariana immediately understood she was being blackmailed. How much do you want, Doña Feliciana? Oh, it's not about money, Doña Mariana, Feliciana lied. It's about ensuring false stories don't spread, protecting your honorable family's reputation. I could help ensure wrong rumors don't circulate, for a modest price. Let's say 1,500 pesos, a sum you'll barely notice. It was a fortune for a seamstress. 3 years of income. But Mariana had no choice. You'll have your money. But listen well, Doña Feliciana. If I ever hear even a whisper of rumors from you, I'll make your life absolutely miserable. I have connections you can't imagine. I can destroy you so completely you won't get work even as a maid. Do we understand each other? Feliciana paled but nodded. She took the money 2 days later and disappeared from Matanzas, moving to Havana, where she opened a modest fabric shop and never mentioned what she knew again. Pedro was born December 15, 1879, in Josefa's room with a local midwife assisting. A healthy baby of almost 4 kilograms with strong lungs, and he had, as Mariana feared and hoped simultaneously, darker skin than any Mello sister, not dramatically dark. A café con leche tone explainable as inheritance from distant ancestors, but notable. His facial features clearly showed African heritage mixed with European. Anyone looking at Pedro knowing the official Portuguese father story would wonder. But Cuba in 1879 was a society where many aristocratic families had African or indigenous ancestors they didn't mention publicly, where asking too direct questions about lineage was bad taste. So people looked at Pedro, noticed his darker skin, noticed his features, whispered among themselves, but never directly confronted Mariana. Ana was born February 8, 1880, Amelia's daughter. Lighter than Pedro, but still with tones suggesting mixed heritage. Rafael was born March 20, 1880, Constanza's son. Rafael was most dramatic of all, the darkest of four babies, with unmistakably African features, with skin no story about Portuguese merchants or Spanish engineers could convincingly explain. When Constanza first saw her son, she cried not from horror but from something more complex. She cried because Rafael was beautiful. She cried because she saw Miguel in every line of his small face. She cried because she loved this baby fiercely and simultaneously knew his existence was living. Evidence of the secret that would destroy her family if revealed. Elena, the fourth and last baby, was born March 28, 1880, Laura's daughter. She was lightest of the four, with more ambiguous features that could pass more easily as completely European. Mariana's plan had completed. 4 grandchildren, all healthy, all born within the planned period. Now time to fulfill her promise to Miguel. In April 1880, Mariana summoned Miguel to the library one last time. On the desk was the document that would change his life, his Carta de Alforja, his legal certificate of freedom, properly signed and sealed. "As I promised," Mariana said, pushing the document toward him. "You're free, Miguel. Legally, as of this moment, you're a free man. There are also 200 pesos here to help you establish yourself wherever you choose. I suggest Havana or Santiago, large cities where you can disappear into the free colored population." Miguel took the document with trembling hands. After 35 years of life, 32 as a slave, he finally had the paper making him legally free. It should have been the happiest moment of his life. Instead, he felt mainly pain. "Can I see them?" he asked with hoarse voice. "The children? Just once before I leave?" "No," Mariana responded firmly. "That wasn't part of the deal. It's better for everyone if you simply leave, Miguel. Begin your new life without looking back." "How can I not look back?" Miguel exploded, composure finally breaking. "I have 4 children. 4. Pedro, Ana, Rafael, Elena. I've seen them from afar while working the fields. I've seen wet nurses carrying them. I've seen their little faces. And you tell me to simply leave and pretend they don't exist? They don't have to exist for you because legally they don't exist for you," Mariana responded with hard voice. "You're not their father before the law. You're a biological donor who fulfilled a function and now must disappear. That was always the deal." Miguel looked at her with eyes burning with fury and pain. "You've given me freedom, Doña Mariana, but you've taken something worth more than freedom. You've taken my children. And someday, when they're grown, when they ask questions about their fathers, when they notice they don't resemble any story you tell them, the truth will come out. Secrets like this never stay buried forever. And when it comes out, I hope it's worth what it cost you." Miguel took his Carta de Alforja and his 200 pesos and left the San Jose hacienda that afternoon, walking down the long palm-lined entrance road without looking back, because if he looked back, he knew he wouldn't have strength to keep walking. Miguel arrived in Havana a week later after the 100-kilometer journey from Matanzas. He found a room in San Isidro neighborhood, sharing with 3 other freedmen. Found work as a loader at Havana port, the same port where he'd arrived chained on a slave ship 5 years earlier. Now he worked there as a free man, earning small but real salary, able to come and go as he wished. It should have been liberating. Instead, Miguel felt empty. He worked days loading sugar sacks and rum barrels from warehouses to ships departing for Spain and the United States. Brutal work destroying men's backs and shoulders in few years. But Miguel was strong, and work at least gave him something to focus on besides constant pain of knowing he had 4 children just 100 kilometers away he'd never know. Nights he drank cheap rum in port taverns with other workers, listening to stories of men who'd been slaves, were now free, but discovered freedom in a society seeing them as inferior was barely better than slavery in many ways. Miguel lasted 1 year and 10 months as a free man. On February 12, 1881, he was working at the port when a horrible accident occurred. A crane lifting heavy cargo of agricultural machinery failed. The load fell. Miguel, directly beneath guiding the load, had no chance to escape. He was crushed instantly, dying on the spot before help could arrive. He was 36 years old. He'd been legally free less than 2 years. No one claimed his body. He had no known family in Havana, no deep connections. He was simply another disposable port worker in a city full of disposable port workers. He was buried in a common grave in Havana's indigent cemetery, without headstone, without marker, without anything indicating Miguel de Angola had ever existed, or that he'd left 4 children in the world. At the San Jose Hacienda, no one learned of Miguel's death for months. When news finally arrived through a merchant traveling between Havana and Matanzas, Mariana felt a pang of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps relief that the last witness to her plan was now permanently silenced. She told her daughters nothing. No reason to. Miguel was already dead to them anyway, dead from the moment he left the hacienda with his Carta de Alforja. But Constanza learned. Constanza, who developed that dangerous connection with Miguel, who thought about him constantly while raising Rafael, who wondered if Miguel thought about his children in Havana. Constanza overheard when the merchant mentioned the port accident to Mariana, heard about the port worker crushed by fallen machinery, heard the name Miguel de Angola, freedman from Matanzas, and something in her broke that day. Constanza cried in private for weeks, cried for Miguel, for the injustice of it all, for the fact he'd won freedom only to die brutally working as beast of burden at the port. Cried because Rafael would never know his father, never hear his voice, never know he'd come from a brilliant, strong man who deserved so much more than life gave him. And cried for herself, for realizing what she'd felt for Miguel was deeper than she'd allowed herself to admit while he was alive. The 4 sisters lived long lives permanently marked by what they'd done. Josefa married at 32, dedicating her life secretly to abolitionist causes, financing schools for freed peoples. Children. Her penance. Amelia never married. When Mariana died in 1891 at 50 from sudden heart attack, Amelia inherited part of San Jose Hacienda, converting it to a farm employing free wage workers, treating them with unusual fairness. Her redemption. Constanza suffered most visibly. She dedicated herself completely to raising Rafael, who grew up darkest of the 4 children, most obviously of mixed African descent. Rafael faced constant discrimination. Constanza wrote extensively in private diaries, documenting the entire story, her encounters with Miguel, his death, the guilt consuming her. She wrote as confession, as record for some future where maybe the truth would matter. Laura married young at 19. She desperately tried to forget everything, bury the memories, never speaking of Miguel again. The 4 children grew up as cousins, playing together, not knowing they shared the same father. As they grew, some noticed similarities difficult to explain. They had the same gestures, but they never questioned the official narrative. Safer not to ask uncomfortable questions. None of the 4 ever knew the truth about Miguel de Angola during their lifetimes, but truth has a way of emerging. In 1947, 2 months after Pedro's death, one of his daughters found Constanza's diaries in her great-aunt Amelia's attic. The diaries Constanza had kept from 1879 until 1923, meticulously documenting everything: Mariana's plan, the encounters with Miguel, the pregnancies, Miguel's death, the consuming guilt. Pedro's granddaughter read with growing horror. Her grandfather wasn't the son of a dead Portuguese merchant, but of an Angolan slave named Miguel. She faced an impossible decision: reveal this truth or keep the secret. She decided to keep it, at least during her lifetime. The diaries remained hidden for more decades, passing to other descendants, discovered and rediscovered, each generation deciding what to do with this explosive truth. It wasn't until the early 21st century, more than 120 years later, that the diaries were finally donated to a historical archive in Havana by a descendant who felt the story deserved to be known, that Miguel deserved to be remembered. The historians who studied the diaries were fascinated and horrified, an extraordinary window into slavery's final years in Cuba, into how the system corrupted everyone. It was Mariana's story, a woman so controlled by patriarchal society she responded with absolute control over others, reproducing the same domination oppressing her. It was the sisters' story, forced to participate in horror but dedicating their lives to reparation. It was Miguel's story, surviving slavery only to discover legal freedom wasn't real freedom, living barely 2 years free before dying in conditions barely better than enslavement. By 2025, approximately 145 years later, there could be thousands of Miguel de Angola's descendants living in Cuba, the United States, Spain, all carrying his DNA without knowing his name, his story, without knowing they descend from a man enslaved, used, freed, forgotten, who died alone without recognition. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Mariana was victim of patriarchal society, but perpetrator of horrible violence against Miguel and her daughters. The sisters were victims but also complicit. Miguel was victim of the entire system. There's no way to make this morally simple. No clear villains and heroes because everyone is both. What remains clear is slavery absolutely corrupted everything it touched. It corrupted family relationships, turning mothers into procurers of daughters. It corrupted love, making authentic relationships impossible. It corrupted paternity, stealing Miguel's right to know his children. It corrupted freedom itself, turning manumission into something poisoned. The effects of that system continue resonating generations later, in thousands of Miguel's descendants who will never know his name, in family histories built on lies, in buried secrets. Behind every slavery statistic, behind every number of millions enslaved, there were individuals with names, stories, loves and losses as real as anyone's. Miguel de Angola existed. He had 4 children he never knew. He lived 36 years, 32 as a slave, less than 2 as a free man. He died alone, forgotten, buried without marker in a common grave. But his story survives in Constanza's diaries, who loved him in ways she could never express, who documented everything so that someday Miguel would be remembered. And in being remembered, Miguel de Angola, slave, father, victim, human being, finally receives what was denied him in life, recognition that he mattered, that his story matters, that the system using and destroying him was evil, and that everyone it touched paid terrible prices echoing through generations we can still hear today.